We're looking at 4 commands Peter gives to the young church in the midst of the Roman Empire. 1 Peter 2:17 says, "Show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor." These commands also, I believe, tell us how best to be the church in a post-Christian era. If the first command directs us outward to the world, and the second inward toward those in the church, the third, fear God, directs us upward in our relationship to God. Before we get too far, we need a refresher on what the biblical authors mean by the concept, the fear of God. Like love, the fear of God is a major biblical theme with many facets, but let me read just 2 verses where the fear of God is mentioned. In Leviticus 25:17, we hear, "Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God." And the author of Ecclesiastes ends his thoughts by insisting, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." You've probably heard at one time or another that the fear of God isn't about being afraid of God, but having reverence for him. And I get what's being said there, but frankly, that really isn't the way the Bible speaks of the fear of God. That's because we've taken the fear of God and portrayed it primarily in terms of an internalized attitude or frame of mind. In fact, by internalizing the fear of God to an attitude, we may actually be missing the very concrete, externalized way in which the Bible speaks of how someone fears God. Even the 2 verses I just read speak not to an attitude, but to the outworking of our actions. The first text powerfully juxtaposes the fear of God with not taking advantage of others. And the second verse pairs up the fear of God with obedience to his commands. Fearing God then practically means both acting properly to others and doing what God commands us to do. But let's return to Peter's text. One thing I've wondered about is why Peter lists fear of God third in the list of commands. Seems odd, doesn't it? Kind of like Peter is saying, listen, if you're really going to be the church, you need to respect everyone, love one another, and fear God too. But really, I don't think fear of God was an afterthought for Peter. Rather, he wants us to understand that the fear of God doesn't take place in a vacuum, but in a particular time, place, and context. We always live before a watching world, and we always do so together as the church, the family of faith. And beyond that, we always do this in a particular place and time in history. Once we understand this, we can really begin properly to live out the fear of God. This means Peter was calling Christians to respect others and love the family of faith in the first century Rome. In his day, Christianity wasn't dominant. Christians were often under the threat of persecution, and they had no public social safety net. And sometimes there were demands to worship the emperor just to get basic services. This was the era in which the early Christians were called to live. For us, however, living in 21st century Canada, we need to learn to fear God in the midst of a materialistic, hedonistic, liberal, secular democracy. Yes, there was a time when the church had greater prestige and influence in Canadian society, but that's no longer the time in which we live. That means the fear of God for Christians a generation or two ago worked itself out in different ways than what we're called to do. By training, I'm a historical theologian, and I've often argued that we can learn a lot about how our forefathers and foremothers of the faith lived in fear of God in their context. That's why we study Christian history. But whatever historical lessons we might learn, or whatever lessons we can learn from today's global church, will not be held accountable for replicating what others did in their context. We'll be held accountable for how we fear God in our time and in our place. In order to figure out what it means to live in the fear of God today, we need both to humbly ask God in prayer to give us spiritual discernment, but also to do the hard intellectual study and thinking to better understand the particular issues current in our society. Fear of God is not blind to our context, but is exercised with our wide open eyes and ears. It almost gives us intellectual whiplash to think how quickly the social climate in Canada has changed in the last 15 to 20 years. From legalized same-sex marriage to cultural and legal normalization of non-traditional sexual practices, to legalization of medically assisted death and euthanasia, to the unparalleled online access to any and every form of evil one could imagine, we have our work cut out. We can't assume that how the church feared God even 20 years ago is the same of what God asks of us today. Peter gives more clue as to what it means to fear God in verse 16 when he says, "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." Lots could be said here, but here's the crucial point. To truly fear God is to live in the freedom he's given us. Freedom to serve him, freedom to proclaim him, and freedom to live for him. Or to put it into a rule of thumb, the more we freely live and serve in the fear of God, the less we live in fear and bondage to those around us. Here we have to allow the Spirit to search our hearts and souls. To what extent has the church allowed our fear of other things to erode our fear of God? What are those fears? Fear of what others will think about us? Fear of the government? Fear of being sued? Fear of losing our tax status? Fear of losing influence? Fear of losing wealth? Fear of losing health? Fear of, well, and we can all fill in the blank as the Spirit reveals. It's unfortunate that, if we're honest, fearing God hasn't been a dominant theme in our preaching and teaching and personal devotion. As I mentioned, the more we focus on other things that we fear, the less we'll focus on the right and proper ways to fear our God. Franklin D. Roosevelt once said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," which, when you think about it, is simply not true. What we need to fear, Peter insists, is that after seeking safety and comfort for ourselves, we fail to fear the God in whose name we live and move and have our being.